Hello. Something a little bit different today. I'm going to talk about how I'm using modular synthesizers in the context of electroacoustic composition. Um, I'm using them in several ways actually. What I really want to do today is just to focus on one piece, quite a short, simple piece of music, which yeah, I don't know. I just thought maybe it's interesting to really have a clear example to focus my thinking or to focus a discussion. So the piece I'm going to look at is called Spertions, which at least by my records was done in 2014, and it was included on my LP, Several Circles, on Cusp Records or Cusp Editions, which I will link below, and I'll link the version of it below that's on that album. And I'm going to talk about a slightly different version. It's essentially the same composition, but it's a live version that I created for the I have to read this, the International Festival for Innovations in Music Production and Composition, IFIMPAC, which took place at Leeds College of Music in 2014, where I made a live performance of it. And for this performance, the fixed media electroacoustic material, i.e. a tape essentially, I combined that with a layer of live improvised music from the modular. All the material on the tape was taken from the modular. So it's basically the patch that I was using live is very similar to that produced the layers on the tape. So I'm going to play this piece, and I'll play the original. We have a video of it taken from the festival. So if you want, I mean, compare it with the recorded. The version on the album is a little bit simpler. It's less layered, and the version on the album might potentially be easier to understand what I'm going to say. What I want to talk about, actually, maybe it's just worth saying this before watching the piece, but the events that make up this composition fall in three categories, and the categories are separated by their phrasing, by their tempo, and by their frequency. But essentially it's the same phrase, or a very similar kind of phrase, using the same structure of modulation, the same patch. But the three are quite distinctive in pitch, timbre and amplitude. So they change relationship in this piece, and there's some quite abrupt sudden changes. There's also gradual transitions between the different kinds of phrasing, and there's different kinds of layering and diffusion and different kinds of spatial movement that happen. Although spatiality is not the main purpose of this piece, so the spatiality is perhaps more there just to try and keep the interest going and to keep the ears engaged. But the main interest in the piece, I think, is the kind of narrative created by these different layers, and the fact that these different layers are created from different kinds of phrasing. The first phrasing type is, I'm reading this, I thought I might as well be precise for once. The first phrasing type is derived from a single voltage source that determines the envelope shape and amplitude of the oscillator, and also functions as an audio rate modulation index. What do we mean by that? We mean essentially you've got a slope, i.e. a surge envelope, which is creating pitch, creating the dynamic shape that you hear in the envelope, and is also controlling a second voltage source, which is audio rate modulating what we hear. So it's a good example of something I've discussed earlier, which is morphology. You're basically using the same voltage source to control multiple aspects of the modular, and in fact in this case you're pretty much only hearing one modulation. It makes a very clear shape. You hear it right at the beginning of the piece. You hear this. It's like a line traveling through space, drawn, like throwing something in the air. It's a very clear shape. There's a clear sense of gravity. We've talked about spectral morphology. We've talked about electronics reflecting aspects of the real world. I mean, by the real world, I mean the real physical universe, that we understand gravity, how things fall, how things land, things have weight. You know, if you push an object through water, you get the resistance from the water. So these kind of ideas, I think, are useful to help us conceptualize sounds. So that's the first kind of sound. It's a distinct shape, it's a distinct arc. I think about it as a distinct trajectory. It has a lot of energy to it. And I think it's a little aggressive, a little belligerent, and it sort of, for me, it functions as a kind of question, a sonic question from which the rest of the piece kind of unfolds and kind of responds, and perhaps there's even an argument somehow in this material. The second type of phrasing, which begins at 14 seconds in, is more like a rapid cluster of attacks, and perhaps it has a character of, like, imagines a set of metal objects being repeatedly struck or agitated and then coming to rest. This layer is derived from the same control source, just that everything's at a much higher frequency. Essentially, it's a kind of variation, and there's a sort of certain logic, a certain familiarity between these two sounds, which you may sense or maybe not sense. It's probably not important, but maybe it is important, because if you shoved another couple of sounds together that seem to have similar characters, they might not work in the same way. So although the primary ingredient of this music is definitely not pitch, there is a pitch relationship between this first gesture and this second gesture. And I think dynamic events and variations can unfold from that sort of common purpose. But common purpose, I mean common information source. I mean, maybe this is a little bit the way that Stockhausen would work in some of his pieces, where the material has a kind of serial logic in and of itself, that innately connects it. Whether you can hear that connection consciously in the composition is a different question. You might not be able to. I feel like Stockhausen's proposition was that unity serves a distinct compositional purpose. It gives a certain integrity. Whether it's audible or not maybe depends on the listener, or maybe depends on other features. So its function is not necessarily thematic. Do you understand what I'm saying? That the second phrase is thematically derived from the first. Whether you hear it that way is a different question. This is not ultimately classical music, where classical rules of harmony and form apply. Nevertheless, some of those can be hidden away, and it can work. It can serve a purpose. The third kind of phrasing comes audible in this piece at around just under 2 minutes, like 1 minute 50 seconds. It's higher in pitch and has a noisy, more granular texture. This introduces a kind of instability and unpredictability to the piece, and it's not directly engaging with this sense that I'm suggesting of call and response between the first two kinds of gesture. It comes in more as an independent layer, like above the fray, and I feel like it gives a broader spatial context for the other interactions that are happening. And at some time, around 4 minutes, it threatens to overwhelm them. It threatens to sweep them away. It's like a texture or swarm of sound. There's something kind of threatening about it. I think about it as a plateau of sound, and it's more a texture or swarm of micro sounds than an event. It's not made of tangible, individual, recognizable events, and that makes it more noise-like, more swarm-like. I think about it as a kind of weather that comes in and definitely affects the other elements. And as I say, it creates a different kind of spatial context. It also masks and interferes with the other sound. It makes the dialogue, this conversational aspect between the other sounds, it submerges it a little bit. It covers it with something else. It makes communication difficult. That's a lot more than I was intending to say before playing the piece. Let's play the piece, and I'll say a little bit more afterwards. Okay. Okay, well, as you can hear, that's quite a noisy piece. That's not even, I mean, I didn't pick that because it's even the most popular. That's not a particularly popular piece from me, really. The ones people like tend to be a bit more floaty or a bit more obviously rhythmic. But I like this piece. What I want, I mean, not what I was going to say is that I noticed my hair's changed colour since 2014. I might get some of that. I might get some of that 80s hair colouring for men and make my beard black and hair. So tune in next time to check out my new look. Yeah, it's a noisy piece. Most of what I'm doing live, I mean, if you are interested, I do suggest listening to the version on the album. It is actually clear what's going on. On that, I'm doing a lot of sort of dub, a lot of sending the signals through a lot of delay and creating the sort of extra layer of material. And what do I like about this piece? I think there is a sort of narrative where there's a sort of, it feels like the noise, the third layer is in danger of overwhelming the other sounds, and also the live effects, that the other sounds are sort of getting covered or they're having to sort of fight their way. And I like the sort of narrative aspect of that and the conversation between the elements. And for me, it's interesting because it is noisy, it is quite chaotic. So for me, it was interesting at the time of composing it to try to find a tangible structure to it, where it's somehow worth all that noise, or it's believable, that there's something, that it's replicating some kind of possible event. And I think since then I've also done quite a lot of pieces that had more chaotic sounds, more watery sounds, sounds of things getting washed away, sounds of things under pressure from nature, which I haven't done that for political reasons, but it just seems to be a theme that when I'm playing this kind of threat of the elements overwhelming more structured aspects, just seems to be a theme that I'm really quite intuitively coming back to again and again. And I think that piece is the first place where I explored that theme. I also, what I also notice about it is there's a kind of threshold of sound there where it fills up, and then it kind of starts to clip, and it threatens to go past the edge of control, and the whole piece kind of descends into noise, or threatens to, and that threatening of a collapse that perhaps doesn't quite happen, and what happens to the sound world as it's pushed slightly past a threshold, again is an idea that I took up in future compositions. I think one aspect of it is how much is too much. You know, when is the palette, when is the frame full, and how far can you go with certain sounds, especially when they get very noisy and dense. They might be impressive, but it's very easy for your ear to turn off. I did have a much longer version of this piece that went through 2 other stages, but in the end I thought this is actually the piece. It's actually a short piece, and it wears it by the end it's done, it's worn that idea out. You don't need to hear more variations of that idea for 5 minutes. So the last thing I want to say about that today is that this piece shows very much, well, it shows 2 things. One, how I'm working in live performance. Like when I perform solo, I very often am responding to backing tapes. I have the layer of information that I'm playing live, but I often have another layer of information there as well, which I'm responding to, which is often giving an overall structure or trajectory to the performance, where I have some elements that I know very well, along with what's happening live, which might be much less malleable, might be much less controllable. So I'm trying to work with this control and uncontrol at the same time. But that's specific to live solo performances. When I'm working with groups, I never really, well, I never would use pre-prepared material in that way. It's like in a group, the other musicians are the material. So yeah, there'd be no reason to do that. But playing solo, I'm not always comfortable with the idea of just, well, here's me sitting there with an instrument, and maybe I've got a good idea today, and maybe I haven't, and maybe the instrument's well prepared, or maybe the instrument's a bit badly behaved, and everything that you hear is going to depend on that. That's 50% of what I'm interested in, but it's not 100% of what I'm interested in. I'm also interested in bringing some of the things I'm working on in the studio onto the stage and giving them a sort of second life. It's okay that you work on a piece like that potentially for quite a long time in the studio, and then it's finished and you decide it's finished. The moment you take it on stage and either diffuse it or sort of make a dub version of it or add layers to it, then you're giving it a new life. You're unfixing it, you're unfinishing it. And personally, I find that quite an interesting and enjoyable thing, and it connects my world in this studio with being on stage and performing. But it's very much connected with me sitting here working with the instruments in the way that I've shown you quite a lot of it in recent videos, where I'm looking for materials, but those materials might have a destiny that's quite different from the moment of them being played, that's different from the idea of being a performance. So for me, this little film, yeah, it's showing a performance, but my interest in it is the extent to which it's showing a piece. I have to confess, in order to do this is the first time I've done this exercise of trying to present some material and discuss how it's shaped. And if I did it again, I would probably pick a more transparent piece. I don't think this piece is particularly transparent. But there it is. Again, as ever, I'm interested in any comments you have. Please like and subscribe. I mean, I'm genuinely interested in any comments you have, because I'm only doing this to create a sort of dialogue, to share my thinking, but also to help my thinking move forward. I know what I think about these things, but I also know that these things change, and many of my ideas changed a lot over the last 15 years about what I'm doing or what I'm interested in. So the reason to share it is not for you to go, oh yes, that's true, but yeah, perhaps it creates something for you. Perhaps you want to come back with something. I'm just trying to say, feel free to ask questions, especially below, because then they stay there. And yeah, and it's nice to hear that people give a crap. I think it made this, the stuff I'm talking about in these videos is quite esoteric. It's not, even in the world of modular synthesis, it's not the music I'm doing or the way that I think about it or the way that I'm discussing it here is not remotely mainstream. This is a little I think obviously these are the important questions, but I think not so many people are interested in them yet. And perhaps one reason is that the whole question about modular synthesizers, or about composing with modular synthesizers, or about performing with them, takes quite some time, not just to answer, but to actually form what your questions are. Obviously we don't all have the same questions, and for me, I think from when I discovered that modular synthesizers exist to feeling okay getting on stage with one was already about 8 years, and that was quite some years ago now. So one reason I have these questions or interests I do is that I've sort of been through the crazy Euro rack, buy everything, try everything, phase, and I'm on the other side. I'm kind of looking back at that. So I don't want that to appear arrogant, but it's just sort of historically true that some of these questions that I'm interested in, I think, takes some time to emerge, to float up from the stew of working with modular, because there's so many questions, there's so many diversions, there's so many confusions, there's so many different kinds of decisions that you make just to develop a working system. And for me that took 8 years, so I'm assuming that for other people it would be a similar amount of time. So yeah, this series, it's intended to be marginal perhaps, but it's not intended to be elite or the truth. It's just one person's view on these things, one person's conclusions on these things. However, I do want to try and project those as firmly and clearly as I can, not to convince you of anything, but because that might create a clearer sort of dialogue about which I might learn from. So yeah, that's it. What a fantastic end. I'll see you later. Thank you very much.